If concepts like the nuclear family, like scientific thinking, like hard work for success, delayed gratification, and so on, and being polite actually are white, what might it mean for being black or non-white? I approach this issue of racial reductionism from the perspective of essentialism. And so I'll be primarily focusing on that aspect of reductionism because I believe essentialism is one of the main drivers of reductionism. So we can think of reductionism as a way of oversimplifying a racial construct or any other kind of construct. I see essentialism as the key foundation that allows for that practice to happen. So what I'll be doing is I'll tell you what I mean by that essentialism, and in particular racial essentialism. I'll show some examples of where that is in popular culture and why we maybe are seeing a increase in that over time. And then I'll transition to thinking about what we do about it as individuals and as psychologists. Then we'll have, as Leslie mentioned, we'll have some time for Q&A following that. So, first of all, what is it? What is essentialism? When I'm talking about essentialism, what do I mean? I think this is a good definition, working definition of what I'm referring to. It's category members, in this case, cats, share some hidden internal properties that make them what they are, and cause them to share numerous superficial properties. And so in this example, they're speaking of cats, and some characteristic furriness that links them together as being of the same group. And importantly, there's something essential. There's an essence to who they are that links them all as group members. And so, as the name implies, essentialism is referring to some internal essence that makes individuals members of a particular group. And in this case, it's one's skin color or one's racial identification. And so, what are some examples of this in popular culture? Here are some examples. Here's one example that maybe some of you have seen. This was an example of from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This was up for, I don't remember for how long. It was eventually taken down and removed. But this is a key example of how whiteness, in contrast to blackness, is defined by certain characteristics that make up whiteness and white people. So you can see some examples here of the nuclear family being one characteristic of whiteness. An emphasis on the scientific method is another. Um, and so, if concepts like the nuclear family, like scientific thinking, like hard work for success, delayed gratification, and so on, and being polite actually are white, what might it mean for being black or non-white? Those were some of the questions that were being asked about the presentation of this following its posting. But I think it's interesting just to note that this was considered um, a a a valid representation of whiteness, such that it was posted on the website of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So this was a view not only endorsed by white people, most likely also endorsed by blacks who felt this was an accurate representation of whiteness without necessarily considering what the implications of that were for what blackness is, in addition to oversimplifying what all members of a particular white group represent. So these are mostly positive representations of whiteness, but of course, there are plenty of examples of negative representations of whiteness as well. This is one, a book by Kehinde Andrews, The Psychosis of Whiteness. And in this book, he does take pains to separate what whiteness is versus what white people are. So he makes the argument that whiteness is psychotic essentially, and a representation of mental illness, or consistent or aligned with mental illness. But he does say that this is, I'm not attributing this to all white people. The concept of whiteness is separate from white people. However, it's a very short leap from going from criticizing a concept or construct such as whiteness to actually maligning individuals who might be members of a particular group. And that's exactly what was seen in this talk um, at the Yale Child Study Center in 2021. Some of you may be familiar with this. It got a lot of press in the media. This was a talk delivered by Aruna Kilanani in 2021, where she made certain claims, not just about whiteness, but actually about all white people, generalizing to them as an entire group. Again, capturing this issue or this notion of an essence of whiteness that transfers to all white individuals. Um, I, so here are a couple examples from that talk. I had fantasies of unloading a revolver into the head of any white person that got in my way. Um, this is the cost of talking to white people at all, the cost of your own life as they suck you dry. There are no good apples out there. Again, key to essentialism here, that there's something core to all white people. There are no exceptions. And in this phrase, she's explicitly stating that there are no good apples out there. White people make my blood boil. And then now one might argue that the first point she made, the first quote at the top there about her fantasies of unloading a revolver are, they just represent what she articulated they were, just fantasies that, that she or no one else would ever do anything like that, despite how disturbing those fantasies are. Maybe there's no real risk of her or anyone else acting on that. But in this last quote, this she's expressing something that she actually did act on, where she said she systematically white ghosted most of her white friends. So she refrained from contacting them and engaging them. So she basically dropped them from her friend circle, and got rid of a few of the BIPOCs that snuck in her crew too. Um, and that um, that last statement was one that I found particularly concerning, because again, that's something that she actually acted on based on her essentialist conceptualization of whiteness. That led me to write this op-ed, where I refer to this term of relational pessimism, which I describe as the idea that forming genuine, mutually caring relationships across the color line is hopeless, either because white and black experiences are too different from each other, or because white people are too attached to the advantages of their whiteness to care enough for black people. So this notion of relational pessimism is very damaging to interpersonal relationships. It makes it very difficult to, if you embrace relational pessimism and you embrace racial essentialism, it makes it very difficult to engage and inform meaningful relationships with anyone who is a member of a different group, in this case, a racial group than yours. Some other examples of this type of relational racial pessimism is in popular press as well. These are two very popular authors who have expressed um, elements of this form of relational pessimism. Here is one by Ta-Nehisi Coates, a quote from his book Between the World and Me, where he says that he will teach his boys to have profound doubts that friendship with white people is possible. And Robin DiAngelo, the author of the very popular book White Fragility, um, instructs white women to not cry in front of black people, and in particular, especially black men. She says white women's tears in cross-racial relationships are problematic for several reasons connected to how they impact others. For example, there's a long historical backdrop of black men being tortured and murdered because of a white woman's distress, and we white women bring these histories with us. So here there are individuals, white women and white people being reduced to group members, and black people also being reduced to group members who are sensitive to the tears of white people and are traumatized often by them. So there's a set of rules that is being established here that when you're interacting with someone of a different race, of a white person's interacting with a black person, there are certain rules that you should follow that are associated with historical baggage in relation to those and to those groups. And in order to avoid inflicting pain on those individuals, you must follow these certain rules. Now, I find this to be especially damaging for interpersonal relationships because this set of rules that are being developed have been developed. Because if you were to take this to its extreme, how could one ever form a meaningful relationship with someone who you feel it's forbidden to cry in front of? That seems to be a prerequisite for a meaningful friendship or romantic relationship with someone. This is has been expressed in other popular outlets like the New York Times. Here's a article entitled "Can My Children Be Friends with White People?" Where the authors states something very similar, nearly identical to what Coates articulated. I will have to discuss with my boys whether they can truly be friends with white people. Here are a couple of other examples here. A book entitled Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People about race. And there's a whole concept of Afro pessimism um, pioneered by this book by Wilderson, but has since been extended. So the way they define Afro-pessimism is a lens of interpretation that accounts for civil society's dependence on anti-Black violence, a regime of violence that positions Black people as internal enemies of civil society. So both of these perspectives represented by these books take even pessimism to another level of where they kind of transition to over to being fatalistic with regard to interpersonal relationships across racial groups.